Every country in South America speaks Spanish, except one massive exception that dominates nearly half the continent's landmass and population entirely. Brazil speaks Portuguese while surrounded on all sides by Spanish-speaking neighbors, creating the strangest linguistic isolation on Earth outside island nations. Argentina speaks Spanish, Chile speaks Spanish, Peru speaks Spanish, Colombia speaks Spanish. But Brazil, with its 215 million people, speaks Portuguese exclusively. The border is invisible, but the language wall is absolute. Cross from Brazil into any neighboring country and everything switches instantly to Spanish. This isn't like Belgium, where Dutch and French coexist, or Canada, where English and French share official status across the national territory. This is one giant Portuguese-speaking island, completely surrounded by Spanish, with a border so sharp you can hear it change mid-conversation. Here's what makes this impossible. Brazil is larger than the contiguous United States and holds 8.5 million square kilometers of South American territory. That's 47% of the entire continent controlled by one language, while 12 other countries split the remaining 53% speaking a different language. Brazil alone is bigger than Argentina, Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, Venezuela, Chile, Ecuador, Paraguay, Uruguay, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana combined together. If Brazil spoke Spanish like every rational geographic prediction would suggest, South America would be linguistically unified under one colonial language. Instead, you have this bizarre continental divide, where more South Americans speak Portuguese than Spanish, despite Portugal being a tiny European country. The question isn't why Brazil speaks Portuguese. That's documented history. But how one papal decision in 1494 created this permanent linguistic anomaly. A Spanish pope drew an imaginary line through the Atlantic Ocean to stop Spain and Portugal from going to war over undiscovered continents. That line was supposed to give Portugal a thin strip of South American coastline and Spain literally everything else to the west forever. But Portugal's explorers systematically ignored that line for 250 years, pushing westward into the Amazon until Brazil became a continental giant. The Treaty of Tordesillas accidentally created modern Brazil, and once Portuguese became embedded, it survived everything history threw at it afterward. This is the story of how a medieval property dispute between two European kingdoms permanently divided a continent they hadn't even explored yet. In 1493, Christopher Columbus returned from his first voyage, claiming to have discovered a route to Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. He hadn't actually reached Asia. He'd stumbled into the Caribbean islands, but nobody in Europe knew that yet, so the confusion was complete. Spain immediately claimed everything Columbus had found under a papal decree from Pope Alexander VI, who was conveniently Spanish and extremely generous. The Pope's bull, Inter Caetera, drew a line 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, dividing all future discoveries between Spain exclusively. Everything west of that line belonged to Spain. Everything east belonged to Portugal, and punishment for violating this decree was immediate excommunication from Catholicism. Portugal's King John II looked at this arrangement and realized Spain had just stolen the entire New World, plus his route to India. The line was drawn so close to Africa that Portuguese ships sailing south around the Cape of Good Hope would technically cross into Spanish territory. John II had invested decades building a maritime empire around Africa toward India, and wasn't about to let Spain's Pope give away Portuguese dominance. So Portugal demanded negotiations. Spain agreed because war was expensive, and diplomats met in the Spanish town of Tordesillas in June 1494. The resulting Treaty of Tordesillas moved the line westward by 270 leagues, roughly 1,185 miles, to 370 leagues west of Cape Verde. This new line gave Portugal more breathing room in the Atlantic Ocean and accidentally placed the eastern bulge of South America under Portuguese control. Here's the thing. Nobody knew South America existed yet. Columbus still thought he'd reached Asia, and cartographers couldn't measure longitude accurately at all. The treaty specified the distance in leagues from Cape Verde without defining which island, which league measurement, or how to actually find the line. It was an imaginary demarcation through unmapped ocean, dividing undiscovered continents between two kingdoms, based on numbers they couldn't actually verify in practice. Spain got everything west of the line, Portugal got everything east, and both sides agreed this division would remain firm forever and ever. Pope Julius II officially sanctioned the treaty in 1506, making it Catholic law that theoretically bound all Christian kingdoms in Europe permanently. Of course, France, England, and the Netherlands immediately ignored the treaty because they weren't signatories and didn't recognize papal authority over continents. But Spain and Portugal mostly respected the agreement because neither wanted war, and the treaty gave them monopolies over different parts of the world. Spain could focus on conquering the Americas westward, while Portugal controlled Africa, India, and the route around the Cape of Good Hope eastward. The treaty worked perfectly, as long as nobody knew exactly where the line actually fell once you reached land in the New World. Then, in 1500, Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral was sailing toward India following Vasco da Gama's route around Africa's southern tip. Cabral swung far west into the Atlantic to catch favorable winds and currents, a standard Portuguese sailing technique for avoiding doldrums and calms. On April 22, he accidentally spotted land where no Portuguese ships expected to find anything except open ocean stretching toward the horizon. Cabral had discovered the eastern coast of South America, specifically the bulge of Brazil that protruded eastward beyond the Tordesillas line's theoretical position. He claimed the territory for Portugal, spent 10 days exploring, then continued to India, leaving a handful of convicts behind as temporary settlers. Portugal now possessed a toehold in South America completely legally under the treaty, though initially nobody cared because it seemed worthless compared to Indian spices. The land was covered in dense tropical forest with no obvious gold, no spice-producing plants, and no advanced civilizations to conquer and exploit. For 30 years, Brazil was ignored except for occasional stops to harvest Brazil wood trees whose red dye gave the colony its eventual name. Then Portugal realized French pirates were logging Brazilian timber illegally, threatening Portuguese claims. So colonization became a strategic necessity rather than an economic priority. In 1534, Portugal divided Brazil into 15 hereditary captaincies, essentially feudal land grants given to Portuguese nobles willing to establish permanent settlements. Most of these captaincies failed because tropical diseases, indigenous resistance, and lack of infrastructure made colonization nearly impossible initially, without massive investment. But a few succeeded, particularly São Vicente in the south and Pernambuco in the northeast, where sugar plantations became profitable using enslaved labor. Portuguese settlers discovered that Brazilian soil and climate perfectly suited sugarcane cultivation, creating an economic boom that justified further colonial expansion westward. The Portuguese language took root along the Brazilian coast as planters, traders, administrators, and enslaved Africans all communicated in Portuguese by necessity. Indigenous languages like Tupi and Guarani influenced Brazilian Portuguese vocabulary, but Portuguese remained the dominant language of commerce and colonial administration always. Here's where the Tordesillas line should have stopped Brazil's growth. The treaty placed Western expansion limits that Portugal completely and systematically ignored. By 1580, Spain and Portugal unified under the same crown when Spain's King Philip II inherited Portugal's throne through dynastic marriage alliances. This Iberian union lasted 60 years, from 1580 to 1640, during which time the Tordesillas line became legally meaningless because both sides shared one king. Portuguese colonists in Brazil used this period to push westward, far beyond treaty limits, exploring the Amazon and conquering territory designated as Spanish. When Portugal regained independence in 1640, Brazilian explorers had already established facts on the ground that made the treaty impossible to enforce retroactively. The Bandeirantes made Brazil's westward expansion permanent through sheer aggressive disregard for international law and indigenous resistance combined with ruthless determination. These were mixed-race frontiersmen from São Paulo, mostly descended from Portuguese fathers and indigenous mothers, creating a unique colonial hybrid culture. They spoke a mixture of Portuguese and Tupi indigenous language and knew the interior pathways that connected coastal settlements to Amazonian territory. Bandeirante expeditions numbered anywhere from 50 people to several thousand depending on objectives, funded by wealthy São Paulo elites seeking profit and slaves. Their primary mission was capturing indigenous people to enslave for plantation labor and discovering gold, silver, or diamond deposits in the unexplored interior. The Bandeirantes essentially operated as private military companies, sponsored by plantation owners who needed enslaved workers after indigenous populations near the coast collapsed. They ventured thousands of miles into Spanish territory under the Tordesillas Treaty, establishing trading posts and building roads that connected remote settlements permanently. Jesuit missions protecting indigenous people from enslavement were attacked and destroyed. Priests were expelled, and entire indigenous communities were forcibly marched to coastal plantations. In the 1692, Bandeirantes discovered massive gold deposits in central Brazil, triggering the largest gold rush in South American history and permanent settlement. Gold discoveries justified the Portuguese crown's decision to officially claim all territory the Bandeirantes had penetrated, regardless of Spanish treaty rights entirely. By 1750, Brazil had expanded so far beyond the Tordesillas line that Spain and Portugal signed a new treaty accepting reality on the ground. The Treaty of Madrid formalized the principle of uti possidetis. Whoever physically possesses the land owns it legally. Treaties be damned if possession is established. Portugal kept everything the Bandeirantes had conquered. Spain received other territorial concessions, and the Tordesillas line was officially declared void after 256 years. Brazil's borders were finalized through negotiations and border wars over the next 150 years, creating the massive territory that exists today essentially unchanged. The Portuguese language had already embedded itself across this vast territory through settlements, missions, trading posts, and administrative centers impossible to uproot later. Spain never seriously tried to reconquer Portuguese Brazil because the territory was massive, defended, and economically integrated under Portuguese colonial administration already established. The Amazon rainforest created a natural barrier between Spanish Peru and Portuguese Brazil, making military invasion logistically impossible without enormous expense and risk. By the time Spain might have mustered forces to reclaim treaty-violating territory, Portugal had built an entire colonial economy around sugar, gold, and diamonds. Trying to impose Spanish on millions of Portuguese-speaking colonists, enslaved Africans, and mixed-race populations would require cultural genocide that even Spanish conquistadors recognized as impractical. Besides, Spain had conquered the Aztec and Inca empires with their silver mines, making Brazilian gold less strategically critical to Spanish imperial ambitions overall. The result was linguistic path dependency. Once Portuguese became Brazil's administrative and commercial language, changing it became effectively impossible, even when governments tried. When Brazil declared independence from Portugal in 1822, Portuguese remained the national language because 300 years of colonization had created Portuguese-speaking Brazilian identity. Unlike Spanish America, which fragmented into many separate countries, Brazil remained unified as one nation, partly because Portuguese created common linguistic bonds everywhere. Argentine revolutionaries spoke Spanish, Chilean patriots spoke Spanish, Colombian liberals spoke Spanish, but Brazilian independence leaders spoke Portuguese, creating automatic distinction and separation. The Portuguese language became a marker of Brazilian national identity, separate from Spanish-speaking neighbors, reinforcing political borders through cultural and linguistic differences permanently. Brazil is massive today because the Tordesillas line was impossible to enforce once Portuguese colonists established physical presence beyond treaty boundaries systematically over centuries. Chile is a thin sliver because the Andes Mountains and Pacific Ocean constrained Spanish colonization, creating geographic limits that forced linear territorial development. Peru is large but not Brazil-sized because Spanish colonization focused on highland indigenous empires rather than lowland. Amazon penetration that Portuguese Bandeirantes prioritized. Argentina expanded south into Patagonia, but never west across the Andes or north into the Amazon, where Portuguese claims were already militarily defended. Brazil swallowed half the continent because Portuguese explorers ignored a papal treaty, and nobody could stop them once Portuguese settlements became permanent established facts. In 2025, Brazil remains linguistically isolated from its neighbors, because that 1494 treaty created a split that 530 years of history couldn't erase. The border between Brazil and Argentina isn't just political, it's linguistic. Cross the Uruguay River and Spanish instantly replaces Portuguese in every sign. Brazilian tourists in Peru must learn Spanish or hire translators, despite sharing a 1,000-mile border, because language walls are absolute at frontiers. Colombian businesses trading with Brazil must maintain Portuguese-speaking staff, because Brazilians don't speak Spanish, and Spanish speakers don't understand Portuguese fluently enough. Diplomatic conferences in South America require simultaneous translation between Portuguese and Spanish, even though the languages share 89% lexical similarity and common Latin roots. The linguistic isolation creates a continent within a continent dynamic, where Brazil operates separately from Hispanic South America, culturally and economically, despite geographic proximity. Brazilian popular culture dominates Portuguese-speaking Africa, Portugal, and East Timor, but barely penetrates Spanish-speaking Argentina, Chile, or Colombia, unless specifically translated. Brazilian music, telenovelas, and literature created a Portuguese-speaking cultural sphere of 250 million people globally. But Spanish remains completely separate, with 580 million speakers. Trade negotiations between Brazil and Hispanic neighbors require careful linguistic consideration, because contracts, laws, and regulations must be translated with legal precision constantly. Even the internet splits South America. Brazilian websites use Portuguese, Argentine websites use Spanish, and cross-border e-commerce requires bilingual platforms for basic functionality. The Tordesillas line doesn't exist on any modern map but remains perfectly visible through language patterns that divide South America into two incompatible linguistic zones. You can trace the old treaty boundary by mapping where Portuguese ends and Spanish begins. The correlation is shockingly precise. 530 years later, night satellite photos show economic development differences at the Brazilian border, partly because linguistic barriers reduce trade and cultural exchange between neighboring regions persistently. Educational systems are completely separate. Brazilian students learn Brazilian history in Portuguese. Argentine students learn Argentine history in Spanish, and shared regional history barely exists. Sports commentary fractures along language lines. Brazilian football culture operates in Portuguese. Argentine football culture operates in Spanish, even though they're playing the same game. Modern Brazil speaks Portuguese because a pope drew a line in 1494 that Portuguese explorers systematically violated for 250 years until Spain gave up. The Bandeirantes transformed a thin coastal strip into a continental empire by ignoring international law, conquering indigenous territories, and establishing Portuguese-speaking settlements everywhere. Once Portuguese embedded itself through colonial administration, slave plantations, gold mining, and Catholic missions. Removing it would require destroying Brazil's entire colonial economy simultaneously. Spain couldn't reconquer Brazil militarily. Spanish settlers wouldn't migrate to Portuguese-speaking territories, and Brazilians had developed distinct identities separate from Hispanic neighbors culturally. By the time Brazil became independent in 1822, Portuguese was so deeply rooted that switching to Spanish would be as absurd as Americans switching to Chinese. Today's linguistic map of South America is a fossil record of one papal decree from 1494 that tried to divide the world peacefully. That decree failed everywhere except South America, where it accidentally succeeded by creating two incompatible colonial linguistic systems that couldn't merge afterward, even when beneficial. Brazil's 215 million Portuguese speakers remain isolated from 200 million Spanish speakers across South America, despite sharing borders, trade agreements, and cultural similarities obviously related. The irony is perfect. A treaty designed to prevent conflict between Spain and Portugal created a permanent linguistic divide that still shapes continental politics. The Tordesillas line disappeared from official maps in 1750, but remains permanently visible every time you cross a border, and the language changes instantly. A Spanish pope thought he could divide the unknown world with one imaginary line drawn across the ocean to prevent European wars over undiscovered continents. Instead, he created the largest linguistic island in human history, 8.5 million square kilometers, where Portuguese reigns supreme, surrounded by Spanish on every side. That line has been dead for 275 years. But Brazil still speaks Portuguese while every neighbor speaks Spanish because infrastructure built in colonial times is infrastructure forever. You can overthrow empires, declare independence, join trade blocs, but you can't erase the language that 3 centuries of colonization embedded into national identity. Brazil speaks Portuguese today because the Pope made a mistake in 1494. Portuguese colonists exploited that mistake for 250 years, and language is nearly impossible to change retroactively afterward.